Hello, hello. My name is Derek Coe. I'm a former Christian, and welcome to the Secular Monastic, where we explore all things related to religion and spirituality. No supernatural beliefs required. And today we are going to be talking about the 7 things you lose when you lose religion. Now, because this is the internet, I want to get this out of the way up front and say that the point of me discussing these things is not to try to convert anybody back to religion or especially a specific religion. I am of the sincere belief that most people who leave organized religion do so for very legitimate reasons. Homophobia, misogyny, religious intolerance being taught in church or in another institution, or simply because the doctrines of organized religion lack logical coherence a lot of the time. And more than that, the truth claims that religions tend to make really do just lack empirical evidence to support them. And yet, humans as a species have developed religion, superstition, supernatural belief on every single continent, mountaintop, isolated island, desert oasis, every corner of the globe that they have inhabited. And to put it in further context, our species, Homo sapiens, we've started burying our dead about 120,000 years ago. It was also around that time that we started burying our dead with household items and clothing and jewelry, things that would have been much harder to come by in a world with scarcer resources, or at least scarcer resources at our disposal, where all these items would have taken more effort and more time to manufacture. And so it becomes quite confusing to understand why our early ancestors might have done this unless they already had some conception of the afterlife in which their recently deceased kin could make use of such a thing. And to provide even further context, we as a species only started domesticating dogs about 30 to 40,000 years ago. So religious and supernatural beliefs appear to be 3 to 4 times older than our relationship with man's best friend, or at least the evolution of wolves into the domestication of wolves into man's best friend as we know them today. And so it's just very inescapable that to conclude that religion and supernatural beliefs are deeply ingrained part of human psychology, culture, and biology. And if you sent a few hundred frozen human embryos to another star system light years away because the planet had blown up and we needed a way to save the species, and we had AI robots on board to be able to raise these embryos into adulthood on a completely different planet, those humans that were raised on a completely different planet would probably come up with new religions and new gods and spirits to worship. They would be different gods and different supernatural entities compared to what we have right now, but they would come up with gods nonetheless. And so it's worth asking, I think, why our species seem to develop supernatural belief and what exactly it is that the evolution of religion has allowed us to adapt to and cope with. So, with that out of the way, number 1 on the list of things humans lose when they lose religion is eternal life, which can also be framed as the denial of death. So, somewhere in our evolution, we essentially became too smart and too aware to ignore the reality that we are mortal and that all of us are eventually going to die. And while, excuse me, and while it's been documented in highly intelligent non-human animals like chimpanzees and elephants and even orca whales, that these animals seemingly mourn their dead, or at least it seems like they're mourning their dead to us, and at times they even spend long periods of time with the bodies and sometimes the bones of their deceased kin, we still have no direct evidence that this is a sign that any non-human animal has the conceptual understanding that they themselves will die. So it's a really important distinction here. Non-human animals seem to be able to observe and acknowledge and react to the death of others, but they don't seem able to take the leap from those observations towards being aware of their own mortality. And because humans can make that connection between, the corpse of their great aunt Josie in the casket and the corpse that their own body will eventually become, we've invented all sorts of things in all sorts of ways to deny that our own consciousness will cease and that our existence as individuals will come to an end. And that's whether you believe in that's whether it's, the doctrine of reincarnation that exists in Eastern Dharmic religions like Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism, or conceptions of heaven and hell that we have in religions like Christianity and Islam. So religion gives us psychological tools, essential ways of compartmentalizing our subconscious fear of death, and to put it to one side so that we can function normally from day to day. And people in societies like Vietnam or China or Taiwan will talk about their next life, just like people here in the predominantly Christian US talk about seeing their dead relatives in heaven. And even if, like me, you find it relatively easy to make peace with the eventual end of your own consciousness, it's not really something I struggled with, to be honest. The destruction of your own body and the end of your own life, you might find it very difficult to internalize and process the idea that you will never again spend time with the people that you have lost, that you have cared about. And I've lost 3 grandparents, 2 while I was still a Christian, and 1 after I deconverted. And it was about a couple full years into my atheism when I fully just sat myself down and processed what that meant for my relationship to the 2 grandparents that I had lost while I was religious. And I distinctly remember trying to find a hymn on YouTube. It was a hymn in Mandarin Chinese. That was my maternal grandmother's favorite. And she passed away fighting leukemia at the age of 60 when I was 7 years old, and we had sung it at her funeral in Taiwan. And despite me being a 23-year-old man looking for the song on YouTube and hearing it for the first time since I was 7 years old, I remember my eyes welling up with tears when I did. And if you had asked me 16 years later whether I missed my grandmother, if I had stayed a believer, if I had stayed a Christian, I'd probably say that I would. I'd probably say that I do, rather. I certainly would still have fond memories of her. I would still kind of miss the fact that, or just miss her presence and be sad about the fact that when I visit Taiwan, she won't be there to greet me. But I don't know that I would have walled up. I don't know that I would have cried again. And it was just very clear to me that the nature of my grief had changed because I no longer had a religious story to tell myself about how I would see her face to face again. And even as a modern secular person who can no longer bring myself to believe in heaven or any sort of an afterlife again, I can acknowledge that that's a very, very difficult reality to square. And that's a really, really difficult situation to accept. And I can only imagine what it would be like for my mother, who was much closer, obviously, to my grandmother as her mother. I could only imagine kind of how people who were even closer had even more life with my maternal grandmother, even more shared memories and experiences, how hard it would be for them to accept that. And so even as an atheist, I acknowledge the adaptive psychological functions that beliefs like this have served humans in our quest to deny death and our quest to not think about the fact that our consciousnesses are finite. And I even have a little bit of firsthand experience from that. So, number 2 on the list of things that we lose when we lose religion is a companion who understands you perfectly. And I should add, not only deeply understands your own personal experience, but also sees and validates you for your virtue and good behavior. And humans are social creatures, right? When we were on the savannah of Eastern Africa, hunting animals, fending off predators, trying to take care of our elderly and our really young children, being expelled from the tribe meant certain death. Being isolated meant certain death. And even now, humans do not do well as solitary creatures. It's much more possible with our modern economies and safety nets and infrastructure to be more isolated as human beings, but there are all sorts of like studies and so much medical literature that tell us that loneliness is actually quite bad for not just our mental health but our physical health. It actually like reduces lifespans according to a good amount of the medical literature. And so we evolved this deep need to have companionship and a deep psychological need to be truly understood and to be validated and accepted and loved when we are seen as our authentic selves. And yet, if you really think about it, this is not something that any of us can truly have. There is no way for us to truly understand what it is like to be somebody else. And there's no way for anyone else to understand what it is like to be us either. And the only tools that we have to communicate our ideas and feelings are words, number one, which are imperfect and communicate those things imperfectly to other people. And two, facial expressions and other nonverbal cues that we've evolved to read as indicators of certain feelings and sensations and internal states of mind. And we can try to be empathetic. This is definitely not a statement against empathy. We can be as empathetic as people as we can possibly be, but as empathetic as you are, there's a gap that cannot be bridged between your mind and any other consciousness. And just to drive this point home, an example might be helpful. I can sympathize and empathize with an amputee's feelings all I want. And yet, because I am an able-bodied person who has all my limbs attached, I have no true way to access the subjective experience of somebody who is missing an arm or a leg. What belief in an omniscient God who knows all things allows us to do is to believe in somebody, even if they're made up, who understands our experiences through and through. And so if I befriend an amputee and he believes in God, what that allows him to do is believe in somebody who actually does understand what it is like to lose a limb. And as good of a friend as I can be, I cannot be that companion who fully understands this experience. And more than that, it gives him someone who acknowledges his efforts even when nobody is looking. Now, this is also probably one of the reasons why alcoholics who are religious tend to have greater success staying sober. And this is very, very well attested to in the research literature. In one NIH study, that's the National Institutes of Health in the US, in one 2019 meta-analysis that the NIH did, it was found that in 84% of the scientific studies that looked at this question, religious faith was a positive factor in preventing addiction and aiding in addiction recovery. It helped people stay off drugs and helped them get out of their addiction if they were in the middle of addiction. And if you really think about it, it's not so surprising that religious faith kind of psychologically makes this entire process easier, right? So, for example, even if you know you're prone to alcoholism and you should not touch a drop of alcohol, it can be very difficult for you to resist temptation, especially after a hard or stressful day, right? And if you're not an alcoholic, insert anything that gets you through a hard day that's kind of a cope, whether that's marijuana, whether that's comfort foods that you shouldn't eat. It's very, very hard for us to not turn to kind of like addictive behaviors of some form when we're struggling in our lives. But take the example of an alcoholic. It can be really, really difficult not to reach for the bottle if you've had a hard day at work and you just need a little bit of respite. And that's how a lot of people kind of like start their addictions. And worse, your loved ones will likely never see the 10 times you didn't reach for the bottle when you were alone at home. But the one time you mess up, the one time that you cave into your temptations and you make mistakes and you get far too inebriated, they might react with understandable disappointment and heartbreak and sometimes even anger. But if God is a constant companion, not only holding you accountable, but giving you a feeling of validation, achievement, and pride, when you don't reach for that bottle, when you're alone, psychologically, it is easier not to reach for that bottle, even if the God who is watching does not exist. And lastly, God as a companion can act as a parental or authority figure. And here's where a lot of people might think, like, why would I need a parental or authority figure? I'm an adult. I've been independent for so long. I've lived on my own for years. I've been financially independent for years. But at the end of the day, the reason this is valuable to us is because God can act as kind of the authority figure that will give us a path to redemption and give us forgiveness, even when no other people can, even when your own parents cannot accept or forgive you. And even in religions like Buddhism that lack an all-powerful creator God, this path to redemption exists. And that's very well illustrated in the concept of hell in Buddhism. And yes, there is a conception of hell in Buddhism. And while not all Buddhists believe it, especially believe in a hell, especially in the West, there is a bit of this Western romanticized view of Buddhism that might cause a lot of people in the West to be surprised by this. The vast majority of Buddhists today and the vast majority of Buddhists throughout history have believed in some sort of a hell as part of the afterlife system within Buddhism. But hell in Buddhism is a very different place from hell in Islam or Christianity. It's a place of really intense suffering, don't get me wrong. It is a place where you suffer for, according to some Buddhist scriptures, billions of years, and there is fire that's a part of it. There are very intense and specific tortures that are described in Buddhist scripture that are said to exist. But essentially, in Buddhism, hell, no matter how long you're stuck there, is a temporary place. It is a place that you eventually get out of. And it's conceived as a place that allows you to pay for your bad karma, pay your dues, so that you can leave hell and start cultivating good karma and eventually be on the path to enlightenment. So it's not an eternity. It's not a place of permanent torment with no hope of leaving like it is in Islam and Christianity. It is conceived as, in fact, a part of your path to redemption if you're an exceptionally evil person who has somehow landed yourself in one of the Buddhist hells. And in Christianity, of course, we have a concept that we're more familiar with in the West, and that is the idea that Jesus will always willingly forgive you if you truly repent. And so it is not surprising to me at all that many prisoners find faith after incarceration, or that Jeffrey Dahmer, somebody who committed some of the worst crimes against other people that you can commit and broke so many social taboos while doing so, became a born-again Christian in prison and went to one of the only people he felt could probably still accept him despite what he did, and that was the Christian God. Number 3 on the list of things humans lose when we lose religion is justification for moral realism and an objective system of values. Now, I can already hear the atheists say, well, I don't believe in God, but I'm a moral person. And what are you talking about? Atheists can behave morally and religious people behave immorally all the time. You just need to turn on the 5 o'clock news and look around you. And while on a very surface level, I agree wholeheartedly when my fellow atheists say this, what I fear is that it can become a bit of a thought-terminating cliche that ignores the very real problems and difficulties that our best thinkers and best philosophers throughout history have faced when trying to ground morality so that there can be at least some credible universal moral truths that all people can accept. And there have been very, very few of those throughout history. And even universally accepted moral truths like murder is wrong have not prevented people from committing genocide, have not prevented people from, using torture and death penalties in very cruel ways that we would frown upon today. And so there has always been a caveat to certain universally accepted moral rules between societies, between cultures throughout history. And those caveats have tended to be different, and perhaps that wouldn't have been the case if there was something more objective to ground morality in. So if we can accept that creating moral rules and justifying them with evidence is a difficult problem, we can start to explore why it is so difficult. And the two sides of this debate are, largely speaking, the moral realists on one side, and on the other side, drum roll please, the moral anti-realists. I know. It's a really creative name. And in a nutshell, the moral realists believe that moral truths are like scientific truths. So a moral statement like torturing puppies is wrong can be discovered and validated to be true in the same way a scientific statement like the Earth orbits the sun can be discovered to be true. And on the other side, the moral anti-realists believe that moral beliefs simply cannot be based on verifiable facts and truth about the physical world in the same way that scientific beliefs can. And it is not hard to see why somebody who doesn't hold supernatural beliefs would be a moral anti-realist, right? And I want to be very clear here because I think there can be a conflation. I think there could be a confusion between moral anti-realists and people who just don't have a system of morality, right? So what a moral anti-realist would say is, yes, I have my own morality. I have what morally makes sense to me. I just don't believe that the universe tells me whether I'm right. I just don't believe that I can go out there and gather physical evidence or evidence of any other sort that my own moral intuitions and my own specific morality can be proved to be universal or can be proved to be truer than anybody else's morality. So to illustrate this with an example, a moral anti-realist would say that while they might react indifferently to somebody stabbing a head of cabbage, but recoil in moral outrage and horror and disgust at somebody stabbing a puppy right in front of them, they would say that the science and verifiable facts can only tell them that the atoms in the knife are separating the atoms of whatever it's stabbing, in this case. This person would say that they assign subjective human value to the puppy and not the cabbage because the puppy has a different biology. And for example, there are many reasons why they might assign more value to the puppy than the cabbage. But one possible thing that they might say is, I value the puppy more. I assign more value to the puppy because it has a different biology, because it has nerves, because it has a brain that allows it to feel pain and to feel fear. But this value is assigned by us and not written into the physical universe the way that the laws of physics and facts about the material world are. That's one possible thing a moral anti-realist would say. And the Scottish philosopher David Hume was the person who summarized this the most neatly and the most early on with his is-ought distinction. So Hume would say, for example, that it is the case that a puppy will feel the sensation of pain if we stab it because, its neurons fire, the brain processes, the sensation of pain. But that this does not therefore lead us to the logical conclusion that we ought to avoid stabbing puppies. Now, the way that moral anti-realists get around this is by deriving an ought from an ought. So, and that is very different. So they would say, if I believe that I ought to avoid causing pain to sentient creatures, which is one possible thing that a moral anti-realist might care about in their subjective morality, then I ought to avoid stabbing puppies. So if I care about preventing pain, I ought to avoid stabbing puppies. But you'll notice that that is not deriving an ought from an is. It's deriving an ought. It's deriving kind of what we should do based on what we already think we should care about. And so the universe and the physical world do not tell us anything about the morality of stabbing puppies, and we have to first subjectively assign value to preventing pain and suffering. in order to come to that conclusion, or at least that's one possible way to come to that conclusion. And in fact, most people don't even have that universal of a principle when it comes to this sort of thing, right? So I'll give a very quick example. If I were to go to a farm with some friends, a farm in, say, like Eastern Washington, I live in Seattle, and the farmer were to welcome us into his home, and he were to come back with a plate of freshly grilled ribs with sauce all over them and say, I've prepared dinner for y'all. Now, and like when we asked them kind of like where he got the food from, where he got the meat from, he said, I went out back to my barn. I found my prize pig. I slaughtered them and butchered as humanely as possible. Let's say in this scenario, I slaughtered them. I butchered them. I grilled their ribs on my grill out back, and that's how I prepared dinner for y'all. I would personally feel very uncomfortable with that, but a lot of my friends would not. And the vast majority of people I know would probably thank the farmer for their efforts and go ahead and enjoy their ribs, right? Now, if that farmer were to say that, okay, I've prepared these ribs, and in order to prepare these ribs, I went out into the barn, found the family dog, slaughtered the dog as humanely as possible, and butchered them and kind of grilled its ribs on the grill I have out back to prepare dinner for y'all, I would be equally disgusted, and I would be equally kind of uncomfortable with that. But many of my friends would be disgusted by that situation, that particular set of circumstances, but not the situation with the pig, right? And so we can see now that there need not even be kind of a subjective human value assigned to the prevention of pain and suffering in general in order for us to kind of, or, towards the preservation of the life of intelligent creatures in general. There doesn't even need to be that universal of a value that we hold for us to kind of react with moral disgust and to react the way that we do, right? You don't even need to kind of assign subjective value to preventing pain and suffering in sentient creatures to say that stabbing puppies is wrong. You could simply jump to specifically, I find puppies cute. I find dogs adorable specifically, and therefore I think puppies alone, or puppies specifically, should have value, and that we should prevent harm to them specifically, simply because I subjectively assign more values to puppies compared to other animals. And in the example that I just gave, the only thing informing people's disgust and horror in reaction to the slaughter of a dog for food versus the slaughter of a pig for food is cultural, right? Because we know that there are cultures around the world where the consumption of dog meat is not a taboo. And so it's really, really easy to see from that example that morality does come from, what the culture informs us about. And even when we try to draw our own conclusions, become more consistent by saying, well, I'm going to be consistent and say that the prevention of pain is wrong. It's still us who is assigning kind of the value to something like the prevention of pain. The universe doesn't tell us to care about pain, and more than that, the universe does. There aren't these kind of value particles, right? Floating around a puppy or a dog that tell us that, this is a life worth protecting. This is something we should value. We can't find these particles under an electron microscope. And it's not like these particles just don't surround a pig or don't surround a cabbage even, and by seeing that under a microscope, the absence of these value particles, we know not to value that, these things quite as much, and we can go ahead and kind of butcher them and kind of use them for food as we see fit. It all has to do with kind of what we subjectively assign value to as humans. And I've been an atheist for 12 years now, and I still struggle with this. I still struggle with the fact that, logically speaking, I can't help but be a moral anti-realist. I really just don't see any evidence that the physical world informs any sort of morality or any sort of value judgments we can make as humans. And I would really love to be a moral realist, even though I am a moral anti-realist. And what religion and God and the supernatural allow us to do is ground our moral beliefs in something more than subjective human values, and allow us to kind of like allow us to see kind of moral judgments the same way we see physical or scientific judgments. And a lot of people do this in a really circular way by simply defining God or some other supernatural system as inherently good, and therefore all things that disagree or oppose it as bad, in a circular reasoning sort of a way. But there are more nuanced ways to do this too. When I was late in my Christianity in the final few years, I began to simply assume that humans with their flawed senses and perceptions were unable to observe moral truths the way we could observe scientific truths like the earth orbits the sun, and that perhaps only God could see these truths and only he could communicate them to us. But either way, the lack of religion and supernatural beliefs removed my ability to justify morality with something other than subjective human preferences and culture and tradition. Number 4, and I promise I'll move more quickly because the morality one was, involved a bit of philosophy. Thanks for bearing with me. Number 4 on the list is a sense of purpose and meaning. And one of the main reasons humans fear meaninglessness is due to the immense amount of suffering involved in living. Even the very best lives on the planet have an enormous amount of suffering just built into them, right? Even Elizabeth II, Queen Elizabeth II, the late Queen Elizabeth II, had to grow old, had to grow sick, had to die, and even she had to watch many of the people she loved, including her sister, her mother, her husband of 69 years, pass away before she did. And even the son or daughter of a billionaire can suffer from depression, anxiety, neglect, abuse, loneliness, addiction. And as the Buddha witnessed in 3 of his 4 sights when he left the palace for the first time, according to Buddhist mythology, all people grow old, all people fall sick, and all people will die. And the fact that he was a prince with all the needs that he had tended to up to that point, if you believe the story, and he was about 32, 33 at the time, so still able-bodied, still relatively young, even somebody in his privileged position, even as somebody who was in his privileged position, he understood that even he could not avoid the suffering of life, or at least he couldn't avoid a great deal of it. And so our deep longing for purpose comes from, in large part, from this fact. We need a reason to put up with all this pain and suffering. And for many people who are deeply empathic and sensitive to the suffering of others, there's this additional need to justify the suffering harm that we ourselves can cause just by living and just by consuming resources to live, and contributing, in many, many cases, inevitably to the suffering of others, human and non-human. And I can drastically reduce the extent to which I cause suffering, right? To other creatures and even to other humans with conscious experiences. I can boycott unethical companies and governments. I could eat a vegan diet. I can donate to charity. But the metals, the fossil fuels, the food that I eat still requires habitat destruction and environmental degradation. I can reduce vastly. I can reduce 20 times over the amount of soy that needs to be grown by just directly eating tofu made from soy rather than beef that soy needs to be fed to. Cows that soy needs to be fed to before eating the cow. But even the process of growing soy, even the process of growing 5% as much soy as would be required to get the same amount of calories out of beef, requires habitat destruction and environmental degradation. It kills sentient animals, insects, rodents in the process of harvesting with the machinery that is used for harvesting. The machinery is polluting. And so it's just inescapable that my lifestyle, especially as a privileged person in a first world country, in a developed country, just inflicts, some amount of suffering on sentient creatures. And so we are basically machines of need, right? Like we are need machines that inflict violence and suffering just to sustain our own functioning. And we need a goal, we need meaning, we need something to strive for that compensates for all the suffering we experience and cause. If my mere existence is going to cause myself immense suffering and cause suffering to others, what is it that I'm here for? And is there something that I can be here for that would justify all that? Nietzsche says that those who have a why can bear almost any how. And what religion does is it gives us a why throughout our lives and into eternity by affirming our lives, directing our goals and behavior with a system of values, and more importantly, telling us a story for how even after death, the suffering of the world will be compensated in the afterlife. Because an eternity in heaven feels worth suffering through 80 to 100 years on earth for. And when I lost religion, I lost the ability to believe in eternity. And I now believe that 80 to 100 years is all that we have. Number 5 on the list of things that humans... Sorry, that was a really heavy one. But moving on, this one might be heavier. Number 5 on the list of things that humans lose when they lose religion is a sense of cosmic or ultimate justice. Now, I have to say, for me personally, getting over this was the hardest thing for me. I did not, as I alluded to before, I did not struggle very much with the fact that I one day was going to die. I grieved a little bit the people who I had lost before, and I was a little less at peace with the fact that I was never going to see them again. But all of that paled in comparison to my acceptance of injustice. In terms of how difficult that was for me. And I had always had a very deep sense of justice, and being neurodivergent, I have ADHD, I've always hyper-focused and almost had an excessive focus on the injustice in the world from a very, very young age. I remember one of the very first questions that I asked my mother was, why did Jesus only go to Israel? It's funny. I was like, and maybe this was partly influenced by the fact that, I'm Taiwanese American, and, a lot of the people I knew at church and, throughout my life were Chinese. And I just, I had to ask my mom, like, why did Jesus only go to Israel? Why didn't he go to, say, China and India, which he could have easily done afterwards, to spread the message of salvation there? Why, due to a mere accident of geography, did millions and millions of people have to wait hundreds of additional years and pass away before being able to hear the message of salvation so that they could be saved and go to heaven? And I just found that really unfair, right? Some of us are just very, very hardwired to care about justice and injustice from a really young age and to be curious about why things are the way they are. It's hard for some of us to accept the unfairness that is just inherent in the world. And I watched a very good episode of Hassan Minhaj's podcast recently in which he interviewed Dr. Gabor Mate, who is, excuse me, who is an incredible Jewish Canadian doctor who has done incredible work changing how society approaches treatment of drug addiction and really emphasizing the need to address the psychological side of addiction and not just the physiological side. Advocated getting addicts into therapy, advocated all sorts of really innovative social policies like housing first. And at one point, they get to talking about the situation in Gaza and the famine that was being inflicted on the children and people there by the IDF blockade of international aid. And Dr. Mate, who had lost his family in the Holocaust, talked to Hassan about how it broke his heart so much to see such suffering inflicted on the Gazans and how the dehumanization of Palestinians led to this, and how just human beings don't ever seem to learn the lessons they need to learn from past genocides and from their own history. And in the end, Hassan gives an anecdote from his father in which his father basically lectures him for being young and naive and says, you young people are so obsessed with the idea of justice and the idea of absolute justice in this world and in this life. But Hassan, there's no way for true justice to be achieved in this life. The only time that justice will ever be achieved is when we pass on into the next world, essentially, and God pulls out the balance sheet and makes sure all the accounts are settled up. And both Hassan and his father are devout Muslims. And, you know, Dr. Mate just kind of like responds in a way that I really, really deeply relate to. He says, that's a very, very beautiful sentiment from your father, Hassan, but unfortunately, that belief is not open to me because I'm not religious and I don't believe in God and I don't believe in any sort of a afterlife. And in that moment, I honestly got very emotional because I not only knew why Hassan and his dad held so deeply to the belief that God would balance the scales in the next life. I knew that I simply could not believe that it was true. Like Dr. Mate, I simply cannot bring myself to believe that. And the only thing that I can believe is that we have to depend on other fallible human beings to create justice in this world. Like Sansa Stark in Game of Thrones, quoting Peter Baelish, said, there's no justice in this world, not unless we make it. And that's just not as satisfying. It's not as comforting. It's a really harsh way of seeing things because, of course, we know that people create justice imperfectly and dispense it imperfectly. And maybe the most we can do as people who cannot believe in unbelievable things is be motivated by the injustice we see to create more justice in this world, since we don't believe there is a next world. But at the end of the day, the religious people are able to be a little bit more at peace on this front. And that's something I've had to accept, and that's something I've made peace with. But it's hard. It is a difficult thing to have to swallow. Number 6 on the list of things that we lose when we lose religion is community, and specifically community based on shared values. And this is where a lot of atheists, my fellow atheists, will say, what are you talking about? I have community. I have my dodgeball league. We play games during the season once a week, and we do practice once a week during the off season. Or my book club, my book club meets once a month. We read a book every month, and then we meet and we talk about it. And there's wine and charcuterie, and it's an awesome night I get to spend with friends. And I want to make very clear here that I am not dissing any of that. I am not trying to speak ill of any of that. Hobby-based communities can be amazing. I'm a part of one. I'm a part of the Seattle Men's Chorus, which is a historically gay chorus in the Seattle area. And it provides a lot of benefits for me. It's an artistic outlet. I get regular social interaction from it because we meet on a weekly basis to rehearse. It helps me feel like I'm a part of something greater because our shows are performed in front of hundreds to thousands of people all along the Puget Sound. And, it requires kind of choreography and costuming, and we all put a lot of effort into learning our music, and none of us would be able to do this on our own, right? What I'll also argue, however, is that, your knitting circle, your volleyball league, your chorus, while it's amazing and while it's a great way to meet people and, fight kind of the isolation that often kind of comes with modern life, I'm going to argue that it's also not a replacement for church, and it's not a replacement for the type of spiritual community that church or mosque or synagogue can be. And yes, just, taking the example of what I'm a part of, the men's chorus, yes, we share a set of broad kind of liberal values that promote tolerance of the LGBT community and really just kind of appreciation of the diversity of humanity and the diversity of specifically kind of sexual orientations and sexual identities that exist among us as humans. But I would argue, for example, that me and my fellow chorus members, we don't congregate based on the same set of kind of total shared values. that religious people congregate based on. And the chorus doesn't, for example, provide moral counseling or instruction when it comes to very difficult questions about life. If I went to my section leader, I sing the bass part. So, the section leader of the basses, if I went to him, or if I went to my chorus director to talk about how I could rebuild my purpose or deal with existential dread or the pain of injustice that I feel when I see all the things that are unfair in the world, the most you would probably do, and understandably so, I'm not trying to diss any of these people. These are wonderful people who do an amazing job at being section leader, at like directing the chorus. This is not the purpose they serve, and that's kind of like my point. If I were to come to them with any of these problems, they would probably understandably refer me to a therapist and maybe add a few words about creating my own purpose in my life, learning to enjoy the good things in my life, and spending more time with the people I love. And it's all very well-meaning. This is stuff that we could probably get from most well-meaning people in our lives, but it is not the same as what I would get seeking the counsel of a priest or a imam or a rabbi or a monk. This is part of why religion is so appealing, why it's so popular around the world still. Religion provides you, in a neat little box, answers and ways of coping with all of these really, really difficult questions, and provide moral instruction to your children if you choose to have them, and perpetuate kind of doctrines and a way of coping with life's difficulties through the generations with these institutions that they build. There probably isn't a one-stop shop kind of community like that exists for atheists and secular people like us, at least not yet. I haven't seen it, but that's something that religious people have access to, and it's very, very neatly packaged for them, and it's readily available in consumable form, if you will. So again, secular community is great. Do your knitting circle, do your book club. I would argue that it's not still a stand-in replacement for something like a spiritual religious community. Number 7 on the list of things we lose is ritual and tradition, which ties in very neatly with actually the point about community. And to explore and explain exactly what I feel is missing in the secular world on this front, I want to dive into a religious tradition I've come to learn about and learn to love a lot about. I'm critical of some other aspects, but I'm critical of aspects of every single religious tradition that exists. And Yom Kippur actually just passed earlier in October. And because of where I grew up and where I went to college, which was the greater LA area, I have many Jewish friends who are near and dear to my heart. And just purely out of cultural and personal curiosity, I've asked them about their religion. I've done a great deal of research on Jewish traditions and religious traditions all around the world. But I have to say, Yom Kippur just speaks to me on a personal level in a way that few other religious holidays do. And yes, it is originally tied to the tradition of the high priest going into the Temple of Jerusalem and offering a sacrifice to the God of Israel to atone for the sins of the nation once a year. But for many modern liberal and even secular and atheist Jews, it is a holiday of deep spiritual meaning. You fast for 25 hours. Many Jews spend the entire day at synagogue, attending service, engaging in prayer, reflecting on the last year, and it is really treated as a time to repent for what you may have done wrong and to reflect on how you might atone for your misdeeds or make amends with people you have wronged and repair the damage and harm you may have done to the world. It's not a fun holiday. People don't wish each other a happy Yom Kippur or talk about celebrating the holiday more than they do kind of observing the holiday and kind of like fulfilling the obligations of the holiday. It's actually a mistake that many well-meaning Gentiles make to say like, happy Yom Kippur. But in its best form, it is a day of spiritual reflection, moral development, and reconciliation. And it is a religious ritual that unites the community and imbues a sense of personal meaning in the people who participate in it, all at the same time. And that's even for secular or atheistic participants. When I think about my secular and atheist Jewish friends and how they are able to participate in a meaningful tradition, despite not believing in the God that the majority of their community believes in, I honestly really, really do envy them, because I don't believe that an analog kind of exists in other traditions much of the time. And, it's not that atheists can't create traditions, right? Like, I have created rituals in my life that are really, really similar. And because I love Yom Kippur as a holiday so much, on Christmas Day, I've turned it into, a similar thing, a day of reflection, a day to make peace with my traumas, grieve the kind of expectations that didn't come into fruition the past year, think about all the things I can be grateful for, and, how I can reconcile with the people I may have wronged, or reflect on how I can be a better person. But if I were to even move that to a different day that more people could be available for, and try to get even 5 friends together to participate in, Derek's weird little ritual that has like no history and no existing community behind it, because again, religion gives you this all in a very neat little box to participate in. I think I would struggle. And yet synagogues and mosques and churches regularly fill their pews up with 500 people, let alone 5 people, to participate in these sorts of traditions that strengthen a sense of collective purpose and help, process the events of their congregants' lives. And so to conclude, while I don't think these 7 things are things that only... While I think that formerly religious people, right? I think formerly religious people struggle more and are more aware of kind of the absence of these things. It's not just formerly religious people who grapple with the absence of these things. Religion is evolutionarily adaptive. Remember, it's 120,000 years old at least. It's 3 to 4 times as old as our relationship with dogs. And to give an example, I have a friend from China, or at least, sorry, her parents were from China. Very atheistic country. I believe maybe even one of her parents were Communist Party. I could be mixing her up with someone else. But essentially, she had never stepped foot in a church before her early 20s, and still she had some of the most crippling death anxiety I'd ever witnessed. One of our very first conversations in college was about my Christian faith, because I was still a Christian at that time, and she was asking me basically how I could bring myself to believe, and how she really wished she could believe, because the thought of her dying eventually just really, really terrified her, and it had even kept her up at night several nights, or like very often. And so what I'm really trying to say with all that is, first of all, it's not weird if you feel the absence of these things, even if you have never been religious. And if you used to be religious, especially if you used to be religious, it is okay to grieve these things. You can hold 2 things at one time. You can hold your religious trauma and all of the very, very legitimate reasons you may have left your religious tradition. You can hold all the negative feelings. You can still, feel the anger and process the trauma, the anger you have towards your religion and like the trauma that it caused, while also feeling the absence of all these things. These are very, very important aspects of people's lives. And they fill a very real void. Religion would not have evolved. Religion would not have arisen in every single culture and every single corner of the world if it wasn't an important cognitive technology that has helped our species survive. And so take your time to grieve these things. Take your time to identify them. Take your time to kind of figure out like which of these things are more important to you to rebuild than others. The death of God deserves a funeral. We deserve to grieve our perfect companion who understands us perfectly in a world where nobody truly can. And it is okay to, feel a little lost and feel like, there's a lot to come to grips with when you lose such an essential part of your life. And in subsequent videos, I will be getting into kind of ways in which I've rebuilt from deconstructing my Christianity, and ways in which, other people kind of reincorporate things like ritual and tradition and community, and rebuild a sense of purpose in their lives, and a system of values in their lives when the neat little box that religion gives them with prepackaged versions of all of this have to be discarded. But it is okay to first take a little moment, and you are not weird to think that there is something missing in your life, because it felt really weird for me for a long time. I did not know why I was grieving these things when the reasons that I left religion were, in my mind, so legitimate, and my anger towards kind of some of the harm that my religious tradition did to me and to others was, I still think quite legitimate. So that's all for today. Follow for more, and I'll see you next time. Bye.